Father Thomas Brennan folded the thin airmail paper with the same careful precision he'd used for his morning prayers, his calloused fingers tracing the edges one final time before sealing the envelope. Outside his modest mission station in Kisangani, the Congo River whispered its ancient stories while children's laughter drifted from the schoolyard, where Sister Marie taught arithmetic under the sprawling mango tree. It was March 15, 1964, and Thomas had no way of knowing this would be his final letter to his brother Patrick back in County Cork. Some stories begin not with what we remember, but with what we choose to forget. If you've ever wondered about the loved ones who walked into silence and never returned, share this story with someone who understands that absence can speak louder than presence. The letter, like all the others before it, carried the weight of distance and duty. The work here grows more challenging each day, Thomas had written in his careful script, but the children's faces remind me why I came. Their hunger for knowledge matches their hunger for hope, and both are boundless. He'd paused then, listening to the evening call of the hornbills, wondering if he should mention the growing unrest, the whispered conversations that stopped when he approached, the way some of the older villagers had begun looking at him, with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't comfort either. The political winds in the newly independent Congo had been shifting like the river's current, sometimes gentle, sometimes turbulent, always unpredictable. Thomas understood enough Lingala and Swahili to catch fragments of heated discussions about foreign interference, about missionaries who were seen as extensions of colonial power, about changes coming that would sweep away the old ways. But he also knew the faces of the children who ran to greet him each morning, who called him Tata Thomas with genuine affection, who had learned to read using the worn books he'd carried from Ireland 3 years earlier. Sister Marie, the Belgian nun who ran the small medical clinic adjacent to the mission, had grown increasingly worried. She'd been in Congo longer than Thomas, 7 years, and her instincts had been sharpened by experience. The mood in the village has changed. She'd confided to him just that morning, her French-accented English barely above a whisper. Perhaps we should consider requesting reassignment, just temporarily, until things settle. But Thomas had shaken his head, his green eyes reflecting the stubborn determination that his brother Patrick knew so well. "These people need us now more than ever," he'd replied. "Running away when things get difficult isn't why we took our vows." He gestured toward the half-finished church, its wooden frame reaching toward the equatorial sky, like hands in prayer. "Look what we've built together. Look what we're becoming." The mission station itself was modest but purposeful, a cluster of buildings connected by well-worn paths, surrounded by the lush vegetation that reclaimed any space left unattended for more than a few weeks. The main building housed the chapel and Thomas's small living quarters, while the school occupied a separate structure with glassless windows that welcomed both light and the constant symphony of tropical birds. The medical clinic, with its precious supply of medicines and Sister Marie's gentle competence, had become a beacon of hope for villages scattered along dozens of miles of river and jungle paths. That evening, after sealing his letter, Thomas had walked the perimeter of the compound, as was his custom. The air hung heavy with the scent of frangipani and the distant smoke from cooking fires. Children who lived at the mission, orphans and those whose families couldn't afford to keep them, were settling into their evening routines. Their voices, a mixture of local languages and the French and English they'd learned in school, created a comfortable backdrop to his thoughts. He'd stopped at his workbench in the small carpentry shed where he'd been crafting items for the church, simple wooden crosses, a reading stand for the Bible, benches for the congregation that grew larger each week. Thomas had always been good with his hands. His father had been a carpenter in Clonakilty, and the skills had passed from father to son like a quiet blessing. Working with wood gave him peace, connected him to something tangible and eternal, in a world that often felt chaotic and temporary. The cross he'd been working on was nearly finished, carved from a piece of local hardwood that one of the villagers had brought him, its grain rich and dark as chocolate. With careful strokes of his knife, he'd carved his initials into the base, TB 1964. Not from vanity, but from the simple human need to mark one's presence in the world, to say, "I was here, I made this, I mattered." The cross was intended for the altar of the new church, but something had compelled him to make it more personal, more permanent. As he'd prepared for sleep that night, Thomas had felt an unusual restlessness. The letter to Patrick lay on his small desk, ready to be carried to the post office in town the following day. Through his window he could see the silhouette of the unfinished church against the star-scattered sky. Somewhere in the distance, Drums were beating a rhythm he didn't recognize. Not the celebratory patterns he'd learned to associate with weddings or harvests, but something else, something that spoke of gathering and purpose. He'd knelt beside his narrow bed for his evening prayers, as he had every night for the past 3 years in Congo, every night for the 12 years since his ordination. But that night his usual words felt different, carried extra weight, as if he were speaking them for the last time. "Grant me the strength to serve," he'd whispered, "and the wisdom to know when my service is complete." The next morning, March 16th, Thomas Brennan walked out of the mission compound and into the green embrace of the Congolese forest. According to Sister Marie, who was the last person to see him, he'd said he was going to visit a sick child in a village 2 hours, walk upriver. He'd carried his medical bag, his wooden cross, and a small backpack with provisions for the day. He never returned. Sister Marie waited until the sun reached its zenith before allowing worry to overtake patience. Thomas had always been punctual, respectful of schedules and the anxiety that unpredictability could cause in their fragile routine. When the church bell rang for midday prayers and his familiar silhouette didn't appear on the forest path, she knew something had shifted in their carefully ordered world. The village of Congo, where Thomas had said he was heading, sat along a bend in the river where fishermen had built their homes on stilts to accommodate the seasonal floods. It was a community the mission knew well. Children from there attended the school, and several families had joined the small but growing congregation. Sister Marie had accompanied Thomas there many times, following the well-worn path that serpentined through dense forest and emerged at the riverbank, where dugout canoes waited to ferry passengers across to the village. By late afternoon, when the forest began its transition from the bright chatter of daybirds to the deeper calls of evening creatures, Sister Marie made the decision that would define all the days that followed. She gathered 3 of the older boys from the mission, young men in their late teens who knew the forest paths as well as she knew the contents of her medicine cabinet, and together they set out for Congo. The journey that usually took 2 hours stretched into 4 as they stopped to examine every deviation from the main path, every broken branch that might indicate someone had passed through. The forest in this region was neither fully jungle nor completely cleared farmland, but something in between, a patchwork of dense groves connected by paths that had been carved by generations of feet, both human and animal. Visibility rarely extended more than 20 or 30 meters in any direction, and the constant green canopy above filtered the sunlight into moving patterns that could play tricks on even experienced eyes. When they reached Congo, the answer they found was both simple and terrifying. Thomas had never arrived. The village chief, an elderly man named Mukendi, who had become a friend to the mission, confirmed that no one had seen the Irish priest that day. More troubling, several villagers mentioned seeing groups of armed men moving through the area in recent days, not government soldiers, but rebels whose allegiances and intentions remained unclear in the complex political landscape of post-independence Congo. "The situation grows more dangerous each day," Chief Mukendi had said, his weathered face creased with genuine concern. "These young men with guns, they see enemies everywhere. A white priest traveling alone." He hadn't finished the sentence, but the implication hung in the humid air like smoke from a dying fire. Sister Marie and her companions searched until darkness made continuation impossible, calling Thomas's name until their voices grew hoarse, examining every path and clearing within miles of the main route. They found no trace of him, no dropped belongings, no signs of struggle, no indication of which direction he might have been taken if indeed he'd encountered hostile forces. The night they spent in Congo was filled with whispered conferences and growing dread. Chief Mukendi shared what he knew of the political situation. Various rebel groups were moving through the region, some claiming to fight for legitimate political causes, others little more than armed bands taking advantage of the chaos to settle old scores or seek personal profit. Missionaries, as symbols of foreign presence, had become targets in some areas, though violence against religious workers remained relatively rare. The formal search began the following morning, with the arrival of a small contingent of Congolese National Army soldiers from Kisangani. Lieutenant Kabongo, a soft-spoken man who had attended university in Leopoldville before joining the military, took charge of the investigation with professional competence, despite limited resources. His soldiers, young conscripts barely out of their teens, spread out through the forest in a grid pattern, examining every path, every clearing, every place where a man might have been taken or chosen to hide. For 3 weeks, the search continued with diminishing hope and increasing scope. Teams expanded their radius daily, following rumors and possibilities into ever more remote areas of forest and riverside communities. Radio communications crackled between mission stations throughout the region, creating a network of concerned voices, sharing information and coordinating efforts. The bishop in Leopoldville dispatched additional personnel to assist, while the Irish embassy began its own diplomatic inquiries through government channels. Letters from home began arriving at the mission, first from Patrick Brennan, Thomas's brother, responding to news of the disappearance with typical Irish determination to get answers, and, if necessary, to come to Congo himself to search. The Brennan family, farmers from County Cork, possessed the kind of stubborn loyalty that viewed obstacles as challenges rather than impossibilities. Patrick's letters, forwarded through church channels, painted a picture of a family mobilizing every resource and connection to bring their son and brother home. Other missionaries in the region shared their own theories and fears. Some believed Thomas had been killed by rebels as an example or warning to other foreigners. Others suggested he might have been taken for ransom, though no demands ever materialized. A few, perhaps grasping at hope more than evidence, theorized that he had been injured or had become lost and was surviving somewhere in the vast forest, waiting for rescue. Sister Marie found herself caught between hope and practicality, between faith and the harsh realities of a country in turmoil. She maintained the mission's operations, teaching the children, treating the sick, conducting services in the unfinished church where Thomas's empty chair stood like a question mark behind the simple altar. But every evening she walked to the edge of the forest and listened, hoping to hear a familiar voice calling from the growing darkness. The letters Thomas had written home became precious documents, analyzed for any clues about his state of mind, his awareness of danger, his plans beyond that final morning. Sister Marie had found his last letter, still unsealed, on his desk, along with his breviary, his rosary, and a photograph of his family taken at Christmas before he'd left for Congo. These personal items, untouched and ordinary, somehow made his absence more profound than any dramatic evidence of struggle would have. The carved wooden cross he'd been working on remained in his carpentry shed, unfinished, the initials TB 1964 carved into its base like a signature on a document that would never be completed. Sister Marie couldn't bring herself to move it, though she also couldn't bear to look at it for long. It sat on the workbench, surrounded by his other tools, the small knife he'd used for detailed carving, the plane his father had given him as an ordination gift, the measuring rule marked with the practical marks of a man who built things to last. As the weeks stretched into a month, then 2 months, the intensive search gradually scaled back to routine patrols and occasional expeditions, following new rumors or reported sightings. The forest, with its infinite capacity to conceal secrets, had swallowed Thomas Brennan as completely as if he had never existed. But Sister Marie continued to light a candle for him each evening, continued to set his place at the small table where they had shared meals and discussed their work, continued to believe that answers existed somewhere in the green depths that surrounded their little island of faith and learning. The mission persevered, but something essential had changed. The children still came to school, the sick still sought treatment, and the small congregation still gathered for Sunday services. But underneath the routine, questions lingered, like shadows at the edge of vision, and every evening brought the weight of another day without answers. Another day of not knowing what had become of the gentle Irish priest who had carved his initials into a piece of Congolese hardwood and then walked into silence. The years passed, like seasons in the Congo, wet and dry, abundant and lean, each carrying its own rhythms and revelations, while the mystery of Thomas Brennan's disappearance settled into the deeper currents of memory and legend. By 2014, the mission station in Kisangani bore little resemblance to the modest compound Thomas had known. The small church he'd left unfinished had been completed, expanded, and renovated twice. The school now sprawled across multiple buildings, serving hundreds of children from dozens of communities along the river. Sister Marie had remained at the mission for another decade after Thomas's disappearance, her dedication deepened rather than diminished by the tragedy. She'd become something of a legend herself, the Belgian nun who had refused to abandon her post during the various conflicts that swept through Congo in the decades following independence. When she finally returned to Europe in 1975, her replacement, Sister Catherine, inherited not only the responsibilities of the medical clinic, but also the weight of an unsolved mystery that had become part of the mission's identity. Patrick Brennan had made 3 journeys to Congo over the years, first in 1965, just months after his brother's disappearance, then again in 1974 for the 10th anniversary, and finally in 1989 when he was already in his 70s. Each visit had yielded more questions than answers, but Patrick's persistence had kept Thomas's memory alive in official records, and in the conversations of people who had never met the missing priest, but had inherited his story like a family heirloom. The political landscape of Congo had shifted repeatedly during those 5 decades. Coups and civil wars, changes of government and name, from Congo to Zaire and back to the Democratic Republic of Congo, periods of relative stability followed by renewed chaos. Through it all, the mission had endured, adapting to new realities while maintaining its core purpose of education, medical care, and spiritual guidance for communities scattered along hundreds of miles of river and forest. Dr. Samuel Mukendi, grandson of the village chief who had helped search for Thomas in 1964, had returned to the region in 2010 after completing medical training in Belgium. His homecoming represented the kind of success story that Thomas would have celebrated, a local child educated by the mission who had gone on to serve his community with skills learned in the wider world. Samuel had often heard his grandfather tell the story of the missing Irish priest, and he'd grown up with a sense of personal connection to the mystery that had shaped so much of the mission's history. In early 2014, as the 50th anniversary of Thomas's disappearance approached, Samuel found himself thinking more frequently about the unresolved story. He'd been working with various communities along the river, providing medical care and training local health workers, when he noticed how often elderly people would mention the missing priest when discussing the mission's history. Their memories, sharpened by decades of retelling, contained details that had never been formally recorded. Small observations about Thomas's habits, his relationships with villagers, his plans and concerns during those final weeks. One of these conversations, with an elderly woman named Mama Albertine, who lived in a village 30 kilometers upriver from Kisangani, planted the seed that would eventually grow into discovery. Mama Albertine, who claimed to be 93, though precise birth records from her generation were rare, had been a young woman in 1964, recently married and pregnant with her first child when Thomas disappeared. "He came to our village sometimes," she told Samuel during a medical visit, her voice carrying the weight of decades but remaining clear and precise. "Not the village everyone knew about, Kasongo, but our small place, Mokabi, where the river makes a double bend. He came to see sick people, especially children. He had gentle hands and always brought medicine." Samuel had looked at his maps later that evening and found Mokabi marked as a small settlement, hardly more than a few families, in an area that had been largely overlooked during the original search. The village sat at a confluence where a smaller tributary joined the Congo River, accessible only by canoe or by following overgrown forest paths that were more like animal trails than human roads. "He was troubled the last time I saw him," Mama Albertine continued. "This was maybe 1 week before he vanished. He asked many questions about the forest paths, about which villages had problems with armed men. He seemed to be planning something, but planning carefully, like a man who understood danger." This conversation prompted Samuel to begin a more systematic collection of oral histories from the eldest residents of villages throughout the region. What emerged was a portrait of Thomas's final weeks that differed significantly from the official accounts. Rather than being caught off guard by sudden political violence, Thomas appeared to have been increasingly aware of the dangers surrounding him and the mission. Several elderly villagers remembered him asking about safe routes through the forest, about places where someone could hide if necessary, about communities that remained neutral in the growing conflict. More intriguingly, several people remembered seeing Thomas in areas quite distant from the route to Kasongo where he'd told Sister Marie he was going. A fisherman named Papa Joseph recalled seeing a white priest matching Thomas's description near Mokabi on what would have been the day of his disappearance, but much later in the afternoon than anyone had previously reported. If accurate, this sighting suggested that Thomas had not been killed or captured early in his journey, but had instead traveled much farther than anyone had realized. The pattern that emerged from these collected memories suggested that Thomas might have been conducting a kind of farewell tour, visiting remote communities he'd served over his 3 years in Congo, perhaps aware that his time was ending, but determined to complete some personal mission before departing or disappearing. The image of him carrying his carefully carved wooden cross took on new significance in this context, not just a devotional object, but perhaps a kind of signature or message he'd intended to leave somewhere meaningful. Samuel's investigation remained informal and personal until March 2014, when the mission organized a commemorative service for the 50th anniversary of Thomas's disappearance. Patrick Brennan, now 85 years old, made what he declared would be his final journey to Congo for the occasion. His presence at the mission, surrounded by children and grandchildren of people his brother had taught, created an emotional resonance that extended far beyond the small community of foreign visitors and church officials. During the commemorative service held in the church that Thomas had begun and others had completed, Patrick stood to address the congregation in English, his words translated into Lingala and French. "My brother Thomas came here because he believed in the power of human connection across all boundaries," he said, his voice carrying the musical cadences of County Cork. "He may never have returned to Ireland in body, but his spirit lives on in every life he touched, every child he taught, every person he healed." But it was after the formal service, during a smaller gathering in the mission's main building, that the conversation took the turn that would eventually lead to discovery. Samuel shared some of the oral histories he'd been collecting, and several other visitors, including a documentary filmmaker who had come to record the commemorative events, expressed interest in a more systematic search for Thomas's remains, or for additional clues about his fate. The group that formed around this discussion included Samuel, Patrick Brennan, the documentary filmmaker, a Belgian woman named Elizabeth Dumont, who had grown up hearing stories about Congo from her grandmother, Sister Catherine, the current director of the mission, and Father Pierre Kalanga, a Congolese priest who had been assigned to coordinate the commemorative activities. Together, they represented a unique combination of local knowledge, family connection, historical interest, and institutional support. Their decision to organize one final, systematic search for Thomas Brennan was made not with any realistic expectation of success, but as a form of closure, a way of honoring both the man who had disappeared and the people who had never stopped wondering about his fate. They planned to focus their efforts on the areas identified through Samuel's oral history project, particularly the remote villages and forest paths that had been inadequately searched 50 years earlier. None of them expected that their commemoration of 5 decades of silence would become the prelude to one of the most remarkable discoveries in the modern history of missionary work in Africa. The expedition that set out from Kisangani on March 20, 2014, consisted of 12 people traveling in 2 motorized canoes loaded with camping equipment, medical supplies, and the kind of optimistic determination that comes from having no expectations beyond the journey itself. Samuel Mukendi had spent weeks consulting with elderly villagers, mapping traditional paths through the forest, and identifying communities that might have preserved memories or artifacts from the tumultuous period of 1964. Patrick Brennan, despite his age, had insisted on participating personally in the search. His presence lent both moral weight and practical urgency to the expedition. This would almost certainly be his final opportunity to walk the paths his brother might have taken, to see the landscapes Thomas had known, to speak with people who remembered the missing priest. Elizabeth Dumont's documentary cameras captured not just the search itself, but the emotional undertow of a family's 50-year quest for answers. Their first stop was Mokabi Village, where Mama Albertine had provided the intriguing account of seeing Thomas on the day of his disappearance. The village in 2014 consisted of fewer than 40 people living in traditional houses with thatched roofs and walls made from woven palm fronds. Access remained difficult. The larger canoe had to wait in deeper water, while the team transferred to smaller dugouts that could navigate the shallow tributary leading to the village landing. Mama Albertine, now noticeably frailer than she'd been during Samuel's previous visit, nonetheless insisted on walking with the group along the forest paths she remembered from her youth. Her memory for the landscape remained remarkably precise, even as her recall of exact dates and times had become more fluid. She led them to a clearing about a kilometer from the village center, where she claimed to have last seen Thomas in 1964. "He was here when the sun was going down," she said, gesturing toward the western edge of the clearing, where massive mahogany trees created a natural amphitheater. He was not alone. There were 2 young men with him, boys from somewhere upriver. They were carrying something heavy, wrapped in cloth, and they looked, scared is not the right word, serious. Like men doing important work that must be done carefully. The clearing showed no obvious signs of human activity from 5 decades earlier, but Father Kalanga, who had training in archaeology as well as theology, began a systematic examination of the area. Using metal detectors borrowed from a mining company in Kisangani, the team searched for any buried objects that might relate to Thomas's disappearance. The forest floor, covered by decades of fallen leaves and the constant cycle of decay and growth, yielded only modern debris, a few corroded batteries, some aluminum cans, the metal components of a bicycle that had presumably been abandoned years earlier. But it was Patrick Brennan, walking slowly around the perimeter of the clearing with his brother's photograph in his hand, who noticed the tree that would change everything. A massive ironwood tree on the eastern edge of the clearing bore what appeared to be carved marks on its trunk, about chest height from the ground. The marks were barely visible, obscured by decades of bark growth and the gradual healing process that trees undergo when wounded. Samuel examined the tree more carefully and realized that the marks were indeed deliberate carvings, not natural scarring or damage from forest animals. Using a soft brush and careful scraping, he began to reveal the outlines of what appeared to be letters or symbols carved into the living wood 50 years earlier. The process was painstaking. Too aggressive an approach might damage whatever message had been left, while too gentle an approach might fail to reveal details that had been obscured by decades of growth. After 2 hours of careful work, the carved message became clear enough to photograph and transcribe. TB 1964, followed by an arrow pointing deeper into the forest, toward the northeast. Below the initials, barely visible but unmistakably intentional, was the outline of a cross. Not the elaborate Celtic crosses common in Irish religious art, but a simple, four-armed cross like the one Thomas had been carving in his workshop at the mission. The discovery electrified the search team but also created new questions. If Thomas had carved this message, it suggested that he had reached this location alive and had possessed enough time and freedom to leave a deliberate marker. The arrow pointing northeast indicated direction. But direction toward what? And who were the two young men Mama Albertine remembered seeing with him? Elizabeth Dumont's documentary cameras captured the moment of discovery and the team's reaction, a mixture of excitement, emotion, and renewed determination. Patrick Brennan stood before the carved tree with tears streaming down his weathered face, one hand pressed against the bark as if trying to feel some connection across the decades to his brother's presence in this remote clearing. Following the arrow's direction, the team pushed deeper into the forest along what appeared to be a very old path, now almost completely overgrown but still discernible to experienced eyes. Samuel and Father Kalanga, both skilled in forest navigation, used machetes to clear passage while the others followed in single file, documenting their progress and searching for additional signs. The path led northeast for approximately 3 kilometers before reaching another, smaller clearing beside a seasonal stream that would have been flowing in March 1964. Here they found evidence of very old human activity, the remnants of what appeared to have been a temporary camp or shelter, including firestones arranged in a circle and several pieces of corroded metal that might once have been cooking implements or tools. More significantly, they found a second carved tree, this one bearing only a cross symbol, and another arrow pointing northeast, deeper into the forest. The carving style was consistent with the first tree, and the weathering pattern suggested a similar age. Thomas, if indeed he was the carver, appeared to have been moving systematically through the forest, leaving a trail of markers for reasons that remained mysterious. The third day of searching brought them to the edge of the original search radius from 1964, into territory that had never been systematically explored by the teams looking for Thomas. The forest here felt older, wilder, with massive trees that had stood for centuries, and an understory dense enough to block most sunlight from reaching the ground. Animal paths crisscrossed in confusing patterns, and the sound of their passage through the vegetation seemed unnaturally loud in the cathedral-like silence. It was here, in a natural grove formed by a circle of ancient trees, that they found the third and most significant marker, not just a carving, but an actual wooden cross, weathered and partially overgrown, but still recognizably the work of human hands. The cross stood about 4 feet tall, carved from the same type of hardwood Thomas had been working with at the mission, and carved into its base, still clearly visible, despite decades of exposure to rain and insects, were the initials TB 1964. The cross stood at the center of the grove like a quiet sentinel, surrounded by evidence of careful human activity from decades past. Someone had cleared a small area around the cross, arranged stones in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, and created what could only be described as a memorial site in the heart of the forest. But the most significant discovery was yet to come. As the team examined the area around the cross more carefully, Father Kalanga noticed that the stone arrangement was not random decorative element, but appeared to be marking something beneath the forest floor. The stones outlined a rectangular area approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, dimensions that suggested a grave. Samuel examined the site with the systematic care of his medical training, looking for any signs of disturbance or recent activity. The ground within the stone outline had a different character from the surrounding forest floor, slightly depressed, with vegetation that grew differently, as if the soil beneath had been disturbed and had never quite returned to its natural state. As the sun began to set on their third day of searching, the expedition team found themselves gathered around what appeared to be Thomas Brennan's final resting place, marked by the wooden cross he had carved with his own hands and positioned in one of the most remote and peaceful locations any of them had ever encountered. The mystery of his disappearance appeared to be approaching resolution, but new questions were emerging about the circumstances of his death and the identity of the people who had helped him reach this final destination. The decision to excavate required careful consideration of legal, cultural, and practical factors that no one in the expedition had fully anticipated. Samuel Mukendi understood that they were potentially dealing with human remains, which meant involving local authorities and following proper protocols. Father Kalanga recognized the spiritual significance of what appeared to be a Christian burial site created under extraordinary circumstances. Patrick Brennan felt a pull of family obligation. If this was indeed his brother's grave, he had a responsibility to ensure Thomas received proper recognition and, if possible, repatriation to Ireland. Elizabeth Dumont's documentary cameras remained respectfully distant as the team spent the evening of March 23rd discussing their options around a small fire in the forest clearing. The wooden cross stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, and the weight of 50 years seemed to settle around them like the evening mist rising from the stream. "We must do this properly," Father Kalanga said, his voice carrying the authority of both his priesthood and his archaeological training. "If we are going to disturb what may be a grave, we need permission from the local authorities, blessing from the village elders, and the proper tools and expertise to document whatever we find." Samuel agreed, but also pointed out the practical challenges of bringing officials to this remote location. The nearest government office was in Kisangani, more than 50 kilometers away through difficult terrain, and convincing bureaucrats to authorize an excavation based on their story would require time they might not have. The rainy season was approaching, which would make forest travel increasingly difficult and dangerous. Patrick Brennan listened to the discussion with the patience of someone who had waited 50 years for answers and could wait a bit longer if necessary. But when he spoke, his words carried the weight of finality. "I'm 85 years old," he said quietly. "I've come to Congo 3 times looking for my brother. I may never have another chance. If there's any possibility that Thomas is resting here, I need to know before I leave this world myself." The compromise they reached involved returning to Kisangani to seek proper authorization, while Samuel and Father Kalanga remained in the forest to guard the site and begin preliminary documentation. Elizabeth would use her media connections to ensure that whatever they discovered would be properly reported, and that any legal or diplomatic issues would be handled transparently. During the 2 days they waited for official permission, Samuel and Father Kalanga conducted a more thorough examination of the site and its surroundings. Using techniques Father Kalanga had learned during archaeological training in Rome, they mapped the entire grove, documented the positioning of every stone and tree, and began to understand the careful thought that had gone into creating this forest memorial. The stone arrangement was more sophisticated than they'd initially realized. The outline wasn't simply rectangular, but formed a pattern that incorporated traditional Congolese burial customs with Christian symbolism. The stones at the head of the gravesite were arranged in the shape of a cross, while those at the foot formed a pattern Samuel recognized from his grandfather's descriptions of traditional grave markings. Someone with knowledge of both cultures had designed this burial site. More intriguingly, they discovered additional carved symbols on trees around the grove. Not letters or words, but geometric patterns and designs that Father Kalanga identified as traditional protective symbols used by various ethnic groups in the region. The combination suggested that Thomas's burial, if indeed that's what they were examining, had been a collaborative effort between the Irish priest and local people who had honored both his Christian faith and their own spiritual traditions. The authorization came through on March 26th, accompanied by a small team of officials from Kisangani, including a representative from the prosecutor's office, a forensic specialist from the regional hospital, and Chief Inspector Lomboto, who would oversee any criminal investigation that might result from their discoveries. The expanded group made the journey to the forest site more complex, requiring additional canoes and guides, but it also lent official legitimacy to whatever they might find. The excavation began at dawn on March 27th, with Father Kalanga offering prayers in both French and Lingala, asking for blessing on their efforts and peace for whoever might be resting in the forest grave. The work proceeded slowly and carefully, with the forensic specialist directing the removal of soil layer by layer, documenting and photographing every step of the process. 2 feet below the surface, they encountered the first clear evidence of deliberate burial, a layer of palm fronds that had been woven together to form a burial shroud, now partially decomposed but still recognizably crafted with skill and care. Beneath the palm fronds, wrapped in what appeared to be traditional cloth, they found the unmistakable outline of human remains. The forensic examination would require laboratory analysis to determine conclusive identity, but several factors immediately suggested that these were indeed the remains of Thomas Brennan. The skeleton was that of a tall man, consistent with Thomas's recorded height of 6 feet 2 inches. More significantly, among the remains they found several personal items that Patrick Brennan immediately recognized as belonging to his brother. The first was a simple gold ring that Thomas had worn since his ordination. Not elaborate, but inscribed with the date of his entry into the priesthood, and clearly identifiable in photographs from his time at the mission. The second was a small wooden carving of a Celtic knot that their father had made for Thomas as a farewell gift before his departure for Congo. Patrick had watched his father carve it during the winter evenings of 1960, and he recognized every detail of its design. But the most significant find was a small, leather-bound journal that had been wrapped in oiled cloth and placed near the skull, protected from decades of moisture and decay. The journal's pages were damaged but partially readable, and the handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's, the same careful script that had filled the letters home to County Cork. The journal's final entries, written in pencil, and sometimes difficult to decipher, told a story quite different from what anyone had imagined about Thomas's final weeks. Rather than being captured or killed by hostile forces, Thomas appeared to have made a deliberate decision to leave the mission and seek a remote location where he could die naturally from an illness he'd been concealing from Sister Marie and others. The journal entries from February and early March 1964 described symptoms that the forensic specialists later identified as likely indicators of advanced tuberculosis: persistent cough, weight loss, night sweats, and increasing weakness. Thomas had been aware that his condition was terminal and had chosen not to seek treatment that might prolong his suffering while taking resources away from the people he served. More remarkably, the journal revealed that Thomas had enlisted the help of 2 young men from remote villages to assist with his final journey into the forest. He had asked them to help him find a place where he could die peacefully and be buried according to Christian tradition while honoring local customs. The elaborate nature of the burial site suggested that these young men had not simply abandoned him in the forest, but had stayed with him during his final days and had carefully prepared his burial according to his wishes. One of the most poignant entries, dated March 14th, just 2 days before his disappearance, read, "I have found peace with my decision. The work here will continue without me. Sister Marie is more capable than she knows, and the children have learned to trust in something larger than any one person. My prayer is that my death will not bring more danger to the mission, and that these good people who have agreed to help me will be safe in their silence." The journal also contained detailed instructions for his burial, including his request that the wooden cross he had carved be used to mark his grave, and that traditional Congolese burial customs be incorporated alongside Christian practices. He had specified that his remains should stay in Congo rather than being returned to Ireland, writing, "I came here to serve these people and this land. Let my bones rest in the soil I have learned to love." As the forensic team completed their examination and began the careful process of repackaging the remains for transport to Kisangani, Patrick Brennan sat quietly beside the wooden cross, reading passages from his brother's journal by the filtered light of the forest canopy. The mystery that had haunted his family for 50 years was finally resolved, but the resolution brought emotions more complex than simple relief. Thomas had not been murdered or kidnapped. He had not died suddenly or violently. Instead, he had faced his terminal illness with characteristic thoughtfulness, and had orchestrated his own death and burial with the help of people who had respected his wishes enough to keep his secret for 5 decades. The 2 young men who had assisted him had never spoken publicly about their role, honoring what Thomas had clearly asked them to treat as a sacred trust. The discovery also explained why no ransom demands had ever been made, why no rebel groups had claimed responsibility for his death, and why the extensive searches of 1964 had found no trace of violence or struggle. Thomas had simply walked into the forest to die, following paths known only to local people, accompanied by guides who understood that his journey was a pilgrimage rather than an escape. But questions remained about the identity of Thomas's companions and whether any of them might still be alive in 2014. Samuel began making discreet inquiries in villages throughout the region, looking for elderly men who might have been young adults in 1964 and who might have knowledge of Thomas's final journey. The search was complicated by the fact that many people had died or moved during the various conflicts that had swept through Congo over the past 5 decades, and by the understandable reluctance of survivors to discuss activities that had required secrecy. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mama Albertine, whose memory had provided the first clue leading to the discovery, mentioned during a follow-up conversation that her deceased husband had sometimes spoken of helping the good priest during the troubled time of 1964. Her husband, Papa Francois, had died in 1987, but he had apparently confided to his wife some details about Thomas's final weeks that she had never felt safe sharing until now. According to Mama Albertine, Papa Francois and his younger brother Marcel had been the 2 young men who had helped Thomas reach his chosen burial site. They had been approached by Thomas in early March 1964, not randomly, but because Papa Francois had some basic medical knowledge and had assisted at the missions clinic on several occasions. Thomas had trusted them with his condition and his plans, asking for their help in finding a remote location where he could die without bringing danger to the mission or his fellow missionaries. The 3 men had spent several days scouting locations in the forest, looking for a place that met Thomas's criteria: remote enough to ensure privacy, beautiful enough to serve as a final resting place, and accessible enough for the burial preparations he wanted to make. The grove where they finally found his remains had been Thomas's choice, selected because of its natural cathedral-like quality and its proximity to fresh water. Mama Albertine's account, supported by details from Thomas's journal, revealed that Papa Francois and Marcel had stayed with the dying priest for nearly a week, helping him complete his journal entries, assisting with his final prayers, and preparing for the burial according to his detailed instructions. Thomas had died peacefully on March 21, 1964, 5 days after his disappearance from the mission. The 2 brothers had buried him immediately, following the procedures he had outlined and using the wooden cross he had brought from the mission to mark the grave. They had then created the trail of carved markers leading back toward the village, not as directions for others to follow, but as a kind of spiritual path connecting Thomas's burial site with the world of the living. The markers had been Thomas's idea, his way of ensuring that his grave could eventually be found if circumstances ever made it safe to reveal its location. Most remarkably, Papa Francois had kept one of Thomas's personal possessions as proof of their story: the small knife Thomas had used for carving, the same tool he had employed to create the cross that marked his grave, and the trail markers that led to it. Mama Albertine had preserved the knife for nearly 3 decades after her husband's death, not knowing what to do with it, but understanding that it represented something important. When Samuel examined the knife, he found Thomas's initials carved into its wooden handle, and Patrick Brennan immediately recognized it as the carving tool his brother had inherited from their father. The knife had been a family heirloom, passed down through generations of Brennan carpenters, and its presence in Mama Albertine's possession provided final confirmation of her husband's role in Thomas's story. Marcel, Papa Francois's younger brother, had died during the civil conflicts of the 1990s, taking his direct knowledge of Thomas's final days with him. But he had apparently passed some details to his own children, who were now middle-aged adults living in various parts of Congo. Through Samuel's patient networking, the expedition team was able to contact 2 of Marcel's sons, who confirmed the basic outline of their father's story and added details about the traditional burial customs that had been incorporated into Thomas's interment. The revelation that Thomas's disappearance had been a voluntary departure rather than a kidnapping or murder transformed the meaning of the 50-year mystery for everyone involved. Patrick Brennan, in particular, found himself grappling with complex emotions: relief at finally knowing his brother's fate, admiration for Thomas's courage and thoughtfulness in facing death, but also a kind of grief for the decades of uncertainty that could have been avoided if the truth had been known earlier. Yet as he reflected on the complete story, Patrick began to understand why Papa Francois and Marcel had maintained their silence for so long. In the chaotic political environment of 1964 Congo, any association with a missing missionary could have brought dangerous attention to their families and communities. Their silence had been not just respect for Thomas's wishes, but a form of protection for everyone involved. The wooden cross, weathered by 50 years in the forest but still standing straight and strong, had become more than a grave marker. It was a testament to the bonds that can form between people of different cultures, united by shared humanity and mutual respect. Thomas Brennan had died far from Ireland, but he had not died alone, and his final resting place had been chosen and prepared with the same care that his own family would have provided. The discovery of Thomas Brennan's remains and the revelation of his voluntary departure from the mission created ripple effects that extended far beyond the forest grove where he had chosen to die. As news of the find spread through church networks and media outlets, it prompted a systematic re-examination of records and archives that had been dormant for decades, yielding additional insights into both Thomas's final months and the broader context of missionary work during Congo's turbulent transition to independence. Elizabeth Dumont's documentary footage, combined with Samuel Mukendi's careful documentation of the archaeological evidence, attracted the attention of researchers from several universities who specialized in African history and the sociology of religious missions. Dr. Margaret O'Sullivan from Trinity College Dublin, whose work focused on Irish missionaries in Africa, traveled to Congo in May 2014 to conduct additional interviews and examine the materials that had been discovered. Dr. O'Sullivan's research revealed that Thomas's case was not entirely unique. Church archives contained references to several other missionaries who had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances during the 1960s, and some of these cases now appeared to warrant re-examination in light of what had been learned about Thomas's deliberate departure. The pattern suggested that some missionaries, facing terminal illness or impossible political situations, had chosen to disappear rather than create problems for their religious communities or the people they served. More significantly, Dr. O'Sullivan's work in Irish church archives uncovered a previously unknown correspondence between Thomas and his religious superiors in Dublin during his final months in Congo. The letters, which had been classified and filed away in 1964, revealed that Thomas had been more aware of his deteriorating health than his journal had indicated, and that he had explicitly requested permission to remain at his post, despite medical advice to return to Ireland for treatment. The correspondence painted a picture of a man torn between personal duty and institutional responsibility. Thomas's letter to his provincial superior, dated February 8, 1964, included the prescient observation, "I fear that my departure at this moment would be seen by local people as abandonment during their time of greatest need. Yet I also fear that my continued presence, given my declining health, may eventually become a burden rather than a blessing." The provincial's response, dated February 28, and apparently never received by Thomas, had actually granted him permission to remain in Congo while arranging for additional medical support and a potential replacement. The letter had been delayed by the increasingly unreliable postal system, and by the time it reached the mission in Kisangani, Thomas had already begun his final journey into the forest. This correspondence revealed the institutional dimension of Thomas's decision. His disappearance had not been a rejection of his religious vocation or his responsibilities to the church, but rather an attempt to resolve what he saw as an impossible conflict between personal needs and communal obligations. By choosing to die privately in the forest, he had spared the mission the disruption that would have accompanied either his medical evacuation or his death at the compound. Meanwhile, in Congo, Samuel Mukendi's ongoing interviews with elderly villagers continued to yield new details about the political and social context of 1964. What emerged was a picture of a region where multiple forms of authority and loyalty intersected in complex ways. Traditional chiefs, government officials, rebel groups, religious leaders, and foreign missionaries all competed for influence and legitimacy among populations that were trying to navigate rapid social change. Thomas's relationship with local communities appeared to have been more nuanced than the simple narrative of foreign missionary and grateful recipients that had dominated earlier accounts. Several elderly villagers described him as someone who had made genuine efforts to understand local customs and beliefs, incorporating traditional practices into his Christian ministry in ways that some other missionaries had been reluctant to attempt. Papa Joseph, the fisherman who had originally reported seeing Thomas near Mokabi on the day of his disappearance, provided additional details when interviewed by Samuel in June 2014. According to Papa Joseph, Thomas had visited his family regularly during 1963 and early 1964, not to proselytize but to learn about traditional fishing techniques and river navigation. Thomas had been particularly interested in how local people read weather patterns and seasonal changes, knowledge that would have been crucial for anyone planning to spend extended time in the forest. He asked many questions about the forest, Papa Joseph recalled. not like someone who was afraid of it, but like someone who wanted to understand it, to become part of it. He said the forest was like a great church, with its own prayers and its own wisdom. This spiritual dimension of Thomas's relationship with the Congolese landscape emerged as a significant theme in multiple interviews. Unlike some missionaries who seem to regard the African environment as an obstacle to overcome or a testing ground for their faith, Thomas appeared to have found in the Congo forests a source of spiritual inspiration that complemented, rather than conflicted, with his Christian beliefs. His journal entries from late 1963 and early 1964, examined more carefully by scholars after the discovery of his remains, contained frequent references to the Cathedral of Trees and the sermons of birdsong that had become part of his daily spiritual practice. Thomas had developed a personal theology that saw the African landscape not as a heathen wilderness to be tamed, but as another form of God's creation deserving of respect and contemplation. This theological perspective may have influenced his decision about where and how to die. Rather than seeing his terminal illness as a medical problem requiring technical solutions, Thomas appears to have understood his approaching death as a natural transition that could be sanctified through connection with the natural world that had become his spiritual home. The wooden cross that marked his grave, when examined more closely by Dr. O'Sullivan and other experts, revealed additional layers of meaning that had not been immediately apparent. The carving style incorporated elements from both Irish Celtic tradition and Central African woodworking techniques, suggesting that Thomas had been learning from local craftsmen and adapting his work to reflect his bicultural experience. More intriguingly, the cross bore small symbols carved near its base that Dr. O'Sullivan identified as traditional Congolese protective signs, indicating that Thomas's local companions had added their own spiritual elements to his final marker. The cross had become a hybrid object, representing the synthesis of different religious traditions that had characterized Thomas's ministry and his approach to death. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Thomas's influence on local communities had been more lasting than anyone had realized. Several villages in the region had maintained small Christian congregations continuously since the 1960s, despite the departure of foreign missionaries and the various political upheavals that had disrupted formal church structures. These community-led congregations had preserved some of Thomas's teachings and practices, adapting them to local needs and circumstances in ways that created a distinctly Congolese form of Christianity. Samuel discovered that some of these communities had maintained an annual memorial service for Thomas on March 21st, the date of his death, according to his journal, for the entire 50 years since his disappearance. The services had been conducted quietly, without official church sanction, but they had kept alive both his memory and his approach to ministry among people who had been directly touched by his work. One of these memorial services, held in a village about 20 kilometers from Thomas's burial site, had developed its own traditions over the decades. Participants would gather in a forest clearing, similar to the one where Thomas was buried, share stories about his visits to their community, and conclude with prayers that combine Christian elements with traditional Congolese spiritual practices. The service had become a way of honoring not just Thomas's memory, but the possibility of cross-cultural understanding and cooperation that his life had represented. When Patrick Brennan learned about these ongoing memorial services, he asked to attend the one scheduled for March 21, 2015. The service, held in a clearing surrounded by ironwood trees, very similar to Thomas's burial grove, brought together nearly 100 people from villages throughout the region. Many were middle-aged or elderly individuals who had been children when Thomas was active in the area, but some were younger people who had inherited the tradition from their parents and grandparents. The service was conducted primarily in Lingala, but portions were translated for Patrick and the other visitors. What struck Patrick most powerfully was not just the affection with which people remembered his brother, but the way they had incorporated Thomas's memory into their own spiritual and community life. He had not been preserved as a foreign saint or martyr, but had been adopted as a kind of ancestor whose wisdom and compassion continued to inform their daily lives. During the service, an elderly man named Papa Andre stood to speak about Thomas's influence on his life. Papa Andre had been a young father in 1964, struggling to feed his family during a period of economic uncertainty. Thomas had not only provided medical care for Papa Andre's sick daughter, but had taught him carpentry skills that had become the foundation for a small business that had supported his family for decades. Tata Thomas did not just heal bodies, Papa Andre said, using the Lingala term of respect for an elder. He healed lives. He showed us that we could learn new things without forgetting who we were, that we could welcome strangers without losing ourselves. When I teach my grandchildren to work with wood, I am teaching them what Tata Thomas taught me about patience and precision and creating things that will last. As Patrick listened to these testimonies, translated carefully by Samuel, he began to understand that his brother's legacy was not contained in the wooden cross marking his forest grave, but had been living and growing in the lives of people who had learned from him and passed his teachings on to subsequent generations. Thomas's choice to die in Congo rather than return to Ireland had been, in some sense, a form of permanent migration, a decision to become part of the place and people he had served. The discovery of Thomas's remains had answered the question of what had happened to him, but the ongoing research and interviews revealed something more significant. What he had accomplished during his 3 years in Congo had created lasting changes that continued to influence people's lives 50 years after his death. His disappearance had been not an ending, but a transformation. The decision about what to do with Thomas Brennan's remains became a complex negotiation involving multiple stakeholders with different perspectives and interests. Patrick Brennan's initial assumption that he would arrange for his brother's repatriation to Ireland encountered complications that reflected both the practical realities of international law and the deeper questions about cultural ownership of memory and legacy. The Congolese government, through its representative Chief Inspector Lomboto, took the position that Thomas's remains should stay in Congo, where he had lived, worked, and chosen to die. This stance was supported by both legal precedent. Thomas had been a long-term resident who had apparently made a conscious decision about his final resting place, and by the practical argument that his grave site had become part of local cultural heritage during the 50 years it had existed. Sister Catherine, representing the current mission administration, found herself mediating between various interests while trying to honor both Thomas's apparent wishes and the needs of contemporary communities. The mission had grown far beyond what Thomas had known, serving thousands of people across a region where his memory remained influential. Any decision about his remains would affect not just his family in Ireland, but the many Congolese families who had incorporated his story into their own understanding of history and identity. Dr. O'Sullivan's research had revealed that Thomas's journal contained specific instructions about his burial, including his explicit request that his remains should stay in Congo. But the journal also contained expressions of longing for Ireland and for the family he had left behind, creating ambiguity about what Thomas might have wanted if he had foreseen the circumstances of 2014. The debate was further complicated by the involvement of Elizabeth Dumont's documentary, which had generated international media attention and brought pressure from various groups with their own agendas. Some Irish-American organizations called for Thomas's repatriation as a matter of national and cultural honor, while some African solidarity groups argued that removing his remains would constitute a form of cultural colonialism that ignored local wishes and practices. Patrick Brennan, at the center of these swirling debates, found himself forced to articulate not just his own feelings as Thomas's brother, but his understanding of what Thomas himself would have wanted. The man who had waited 50 years for answers about his brother's fate now faced the challenge of making decisions that would shape Thomas's legacy for future generations. The breakthrough in this complex situation came from an unexpected source: the community of villages that had maintained memorial services for Thomas over the past 5 decades. Papa Andre, the carpenter who had spoken at the memorial service, approached Samuel with a proposal that had emerged from discussions among local elders and church leaders. The community's proposal was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Rather than moving Thomas's remains, they suggested creating a formal memorial site at his forest grave that would serve both as a place of pilgrimage for visitors from Ireland and other countries, and as a continuing center for the local communities that had preserved his memory. The site would be maintained jointly by the mission and by representatives of local villages, ensuring that both international and local perspectives would be honored. The proposal included practical elements: improvement of access paths to make the site reachable for elderly visitors, construction of a small shelter for prayer and reflection, and installation of informational markers that would tell Thomas's story in multiple languages. But it also included spiritual elements that reflected the bicultural nature of Thomas's legacy. The site would continue to host annual memorial services that combine Christian and traditional Congolese practices, and it would serve as a place where visitors could learn about the history of cross-cultural cooperation and understanding. Most significantly, the proposal suggested that Patrick Brennan be invited to participate in a traditional Congolese adoption ceremony that would formally make him a member of the extended family that included all the people who had been influenced by Thomas's work. This ceremony would give Patrick a permanent connection to the Congo communities while allowing Thomas's remains to stay in the place he had chosen as his final home. The adoption ceremony, held in the forest grove beside Thomas's grave on March 21, 2015, brought together nearly 200 people from across the region. The ceremony itself was a blend of traditional Congolese customs and Christian rituals, conducted by local elders working in cooperation with Father Kalanga and other church representatives. Patrick, now 86 years old and visibly moved by the occasion, was formally welcomed into the extended family network that included dozens of people who traced their connection to Thomas through his teaching, medical care, or spiritual guidance. The ceremony involved the exchange of gifts, the sharing of traditional foods, and the recitation of genealogies that now included Patrick as an honorary member of multiple family lines. During the ceremony, Papa Andre presented Patrick with a wooden carving he had made using techniques Thomas had taught him 50 years earlier. The carving depicted the ironwood tree where Thomas's first trail marker had been discovered, complete with the carved initials and arrow that had led to the eventual discovery of his grave. The piece was intended not just as a memento, but as a symbol of the connection between Irish and Congolese craftsmanship that Thomas had fostered. In return, Patrick presented the community with his brother's carving knife, the tool that Mama Albertine had preserved for decades, and that had provided crucial evidence in establishing the truth about Thomas's fate. The knife would be displayed at the memorial site as a tangible link to Thomas's presence and work, available for visitors to see and for local craftsmen to use in maintaining the wooden elements of the memorial. Elizabeth Dumont's cameras captured the ceremony, but the footage was shared with the community before any international distribution, ensuring that local participants could control how their traditions and stories were presented to outside audiences. The documentary that eventually emerged from the project was co-produced with Congolese filmmakers and included substantial input from community members about how they wanted Thomas's story to be told. The memorial site that was developed over the following months reflected the collaborative spirit of the adoption ceremony. Irish volunteers, working alongside local craftsmen, improved access paths and constructed a small chapel that incorporated both European and African architectural elements. The chapel was designed to be open to the forest, allowing visitors to maintain connection with the natural environment that had been so important to Thomas's spiritual life. Local communities contributed traditional knowledge about forest management and conservation, ensuring that the memorial site would enhance rather than disrupt the ecological balance of the grove. Young people from villages throughout the region participated in tree planting ceremonies that expanded the forest around Thomas's grave, creating a living memorial that would grow and change over time. The informational markers installed at the site told Thomas's story in 4 languages: English, French, Lingala, and Swahili. But they also included broader historical context about missionary work in Congo, the challenges of cross-cultural understanding, and the ongoing relationships between Ireland and Central Africa. The markers were designed to educate visitors about the complexity of colonial and post-colonial history, while honoring the genuine connections that had been formed between individuals across cultural boundaries. Samuel Mukendi, whose detective work had made the discovery possible, was appointed as the first director of the memorial site, responsible for coordinating between international visitors, local communities, and church organizations. His medical training and cultural knowledge made him uniquely qualified to serve as both guide and interpreter for the many different groups that began making pilgrimages to Thomas's grave. The site's first official international visitor was Bishop William Murphy from Cork, who came to offer prayers for Thomas and to formally recognize the memorial as a place of pilgrimage for Irish Catholics. Bishop Murphy's visit in September 2015 included meetings with local church leaders and government officials, establishing relationships that would support the long-term maintenance and development of the site. But the most frequent visitors to the memorial were local people, who continued the tradition of annual services, while also bringing family members and friends to learn about Thomas's story and its connection to their own community history. Children who had never heard of Thomas Brennan began learning about the Irish priest who had cared for their grandparents, who had taught their ancestors new skills, and who had chosen to make Congo his permanent home. Patrick Brennan made his final visit to Congo in March 2016, bringing with him soil from the Brennan family grave in County Cork to be mixed with the earth around Thomas's forest burial site. The symbolic mixing of Irish and Congolese soil represented the permanent connection that had been established between the two places, and the ongoing relationship between the families and communities that had been touched by Thomas's life and death. During that visit, Patrick spent hours sitting beside the wooden cross that marked his brother's grave, reading passages from Thomas's journal and letters, reflecting on the choices that had brought Thomas to this remote forest clearing, and the consequences of those choices for everyone involved. The silence that had surrounded Thomas's disappearance for 50 years had been broken, but it had been replaced by a different kind of silence, the peaceful quiet of a place where questions had been answered and relationships had been healed. The weight of silence that had burdened Patrick for half a century had been lifted, replaced by the weight of understanding and the responsibility of preserving memory for future generations. Thomas's story would continue to be told, but now it would be told with knowledge rather than speculation, with celebration rather than mourning, and with appreciation for the complexity of human connections that transcend cultural boundaries and span generations. 5 years after the discovery of Thomas Brennan's remains, the memorial site in the Congolese forest had evolved into something neither the original searchers nor the local communities had fully anticipated. What began as a simple grave marker had become a place of pilgrimage that attracted visitors from around the world, while serving as a center for ongoing community development and cross-cultural exchange. Samuel Mukindi's leadership of the site had transformed it from a historical curiosity into a model for sustainable cultural tourism that benefited local communities while preserving the spiritual and educational value of Thomas's story. The paths leading to the grove had been improved, but kept deliberately simple, requiring visitors to walk through the forest and experience something of the journey Thomas had made during his final days. The walk itself had become part of the pilgrimage, a time for reflection and preparation before arriving at the quiet clearing where his wooden cross still stood. The chapel built beside Thomas's grave hosted services in multiple languages and traditions, reflecting the multicultural nature of both his ministry and his continuing legacy. Sunday morning services in Lingala drew congregations from villages throughout the region, while special services for international visitors were conducted in English or French. Monthly interfaith gatherings brought together Christians from various denominations, along with practitioners of traditional African religions, continuing the spirit of theological dialogue that had characterized Thomas's approach to ministry. Elizabeth Dumont's documentary, titled The Cross in the Forest, had been completed and released internationally in 2017, winning several awards for its sensitive portrayal of cross-cultural relationships and the complexity of missionary history in Africa. The film's success had brought additional visitors to the memorial site, but it had also generated resources that supported community development projects throughout the region. A portion of the documentary's profits had been used to establish the Thomas Brennan Education Foundation, which provided scholarships for Congolese students to attend university, while also supporting vocational training programs that taught traditional crafts alongside modern technical skills. The foundation's work reflected Thomas's own commitment to education that respected local knowledge, while providing access to broader opportunities. Papa Andre, now in his 80s, but still active as a craftsman and community leader, had become the unofficial guardian of Thomas's woodworking legacy. He taught traditional carving techniques to young people from both local communities and international volunteer groups, using the same methods Thomas had learned during his time in Congo. The workshop Papa Andre, established near the memorial site, had become a center for cultural exchange where visitors could learn about Congolese craftsmanship while contributing to the site's ongoing maintenance and development. Patrick Brennan had died peacefully in County Cork in March 2018, 4 years after the discovery of his brother's grave. His family had chosen to bury him on the anniversary of Thomas's death, creating a permanent connection between the two brothers, despite the thousands of miles that separated their final resting places. Patrick's funeral had been attended by several visitors from Congo, including Samuel and Papa Andre, cementing the international relationships that had grown from Thomas's story. In his will, Patrick had left his family's farm to the Thomas Brennan Education Foundation with the understanding that the property would be used to support exchange programs between Irish and Congolese students. The farm had been converted into a study center where young Congolese scholars could spend time in Ireland while Irish students prepared for service projects in Central Africa. The exchange program had created ongoing relationships that extended far beyond the initial discovery of Thomas's remains. Dr. Margaret O'Sullivan's scholarly work on Thomas's story had expanded into a broader research project, examining the experiences of Irish missionaries throughout Africa during the decolonization period. Her book, Bridges Across Silence: Irish Missionaries and African Independence, had become a standard text in courses on African history and religious studies. The book used Thomas's story as a case study in the complexity of cross-cultural relationships during periods of political transition. More significantly, Dr. O'Sullivan's research had identified several other cases of missionaries who had disappeared during the 1960s, under circumstances that now seemed worth re-examining. Working with local researchers in various African countries, she had begun a broader project of historical recovery that sought to understand the full scope of religious and cultural exchange during this turbulent period. The annual memorial service held at Thomas's grave had grown into a 3-day festival that combined religious observance with cultural celebration and educational programming. The festival attracted visitors from throughout Central Africa, as well as from Ireland, North America, and other parts of the world where Thomas's story had become known. But the event remained grounded in local traditions and community needs, ensuring that it served the people who had preserved Thomas's memory long before it became internationally recognized. During the 2019 festival, a surprise visitor arrived who added a new dimension to Thomas's story. Sister Mary Concepta Walsh, an elderly Irish nun who had served in Congo during the 1960s, had traveled from Dublin specifically to visit Thomas's grave and share memories that had been private for more than 50 years. Sister Mary Concepta revealed that she had known Thomas during his final months and had suspected that his health was worse than he was admitting to his colleagues. She had been serving at a mission station about 100 kilometers from Kisangani and had encountered Thomas during several regional meetings where missionaries gathered to discuss security concerns and coordinate their activities. Thomas was a man carrying a heavy burden during those last months. Sister Mary Concepta told the festival gathering, speaking in English that was translated into local languages. Not just the burden of illness, but the burden of loving a place and people so deeply that leaving them felt like betrayal, while staying felt like selfishness. I think he found a third way, a path that honored both his love for Congo and his responsibility to others. Her testimony added nuance to the understanding of Thomas's final decision, suggesting that his choice to die in the forest was not just about personal preference, but about his theological understanding of sacrifice and service. Thomas had apparently spoken to Sister Mary Concepta about his belief that true missionary work required becoming fully part of the place and people you served, even if that meant accepting death as part of the commitment. The conversation also revealed that Thomas had not been entirely alone in making his final decision. Several missionaries in the region had been grappling with similar dilemmas about how to respond to terminal illness or increasing political danger while maintaining their service commitments. Thomas's choice had been individual, but it had emerged from a broader community of people wrestling with questions about duty, sacrifice, and the meaning of religious vocation in extreme circumstances. As the memorial site entered its second decade, it had become more than a monument to one man's life and death. It had evolved into a place where people from different cultures could encounter each other's stories, where historical conflicts could be examined and understood, and where the possibility of genuine cross-cultural friendship could be experienced and celebrated. Young people who participated in the educational programs at the site often spoke of how Thomas's story had changed their understanding of their own possibilities. Congolese students who had received foundation scholarships frequently returned to share how their education had enabled them to contribute to their communities while maintaining connections to their cultural roots. Irish students who had volunteered at the site often chose careers in international development, education, or religious service. Inspired by Thomas's example of committed cross-cultural engagement, the wooden cross that marked Thomas's grave had weathered 5 additional years in the forest, its carved initials still clearly visible, but its surface, marked by the passage of time and seasons. Papa Andre had carefully maintained the cross using traditional preservation techniques, ensuring that it would continue to stand for many years to come. But he had also carved several replica crosses that were displayed at the site's chapel and given as gifts to visitors who had made significant contributions to the community. One of these replica crosses had been installed at the original mission station in Kisangani, where a small museum had been established to tell the broader story of missionary work in the region. The museum included exhibits about Thomas's life and disappearance, but it also examined the work of Sister Marie, the various Congolese religious leaders who had shaped local Christianity, and the ongoing evolution of religious practice in contemporary Congo. Another replica cross had been placed in the small church in County Cork, where Thomas had been baptized and had celebrated his final Mass before leaving for Africa. The cross served as a reminder to the Irish congregation of their connection to communities across the world and of the ongoing relationships that had grown from one man's decision to serve far from home. But perhaps the most significant of the replica crosses was the one that had been planted beside a new tree, an ironwood sapling, in the center of the memorial grove. This cross, carved not by Papa Andre, but by a group of young people from both Ireland and Congo working together during the 2019 festival, represented the ongoing growth of the relationships that had begun with Thomas's ministry 55 years earlier. The sapling had been grown from seeds collected near Thomas's original trail markers, ensuring that it carried the genetic heritage of the forest that had welcomed the Irish priest during his final journey. As it grew, the tree would eventually overshadow the wooden cross beside it, just as the living relationships inspired by Thomas's story had grown beyond the simple facts of his life and death. Samuel Mukendi, now recognized as an expert on both traditional medicine and cross-cultural healthcare, had been invited to speak at conferences around the world about the lessons learned from Thomas's story and the memorial site's development. His presentations always emphasized that the site's success had come not from preserving the past unchanged, but from allowing historical memory to inform contemporary action and future planning. Thomas Brennan came to Congo to serve, and he chose to die here because this place had become his home. Samuel would tell international audiences, "But his real legacy is not in his death. It is in the life that continues to grow from the seeds he planted. Every student who receives an education, every sick person who receives treatment, every young person who learns to see beyond the boundaries of their own culture. That is, Thomas Brennan coming home." The evening before the 5th anniversary of the discovery, Samuel walked alone through the forest paths leading to Thomas's grave, following the trail that had been created by the carved markers and maintained by thousands of pilgrim footsteps. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth, and the distant murmur of the river that had carried Thomas to Congo more than half a century earlier. At the grove, Samuel sat beside the weathered wooden cross and opened Thomas's journal to the final entry, dated March 20th, 1964, the day before his death. The entry was brief, written in pencil that had faded but remained legible. "Tomorrow I will rest. The work continues. The seeds are planted. The harvest will come in its season." Looking around the grove, now filled with memorial plantings and marked by paths worn smooth by thousands of visitors, Samuel reflected on the accuracy of Thomas's final prediction. The harvest had indeed come, not in the form anyone might have expected, but in the form of relationships that had transcended death, understanding that had bridged decades of silence, and hope that had grown from the soil of sacrifice and service. As darkness settled over the forest, Samuel lit a small candle beside the cross, a tradition that had begun with Sister Marie 50 years earlier and had been maintained by countless visitors in the years since. The flame flickered in the gentle evening breeze, casting dancing shadows on the carved initials that had led to so many discoveries and revelations. In the distance, he could hear the voices of pilgrims who had arrived for the anniversary celebration, people from dozens of countries who had come to this remote clearing to pay their respects to a man most of them had never known, but whose story had touched their lives. Their conversations blended together in multiple languages, creating a symphony of human connection that would have pleased Thomas, who had always believed that understanding could transcend the barriers of language and culture. Samuel thought about all the people whose lives had been changed by the discovery of Thomas's remains and the gradual revelation of his story. Patrick Brennan had found peace after 50 years of uncertainty. Papa Andre had discovered that the woodworking skills he'd learned as a young man could become a bridge between cultures. Elizabeth Dumont had created a film that challenged audiences to think more deeply about the complexity of cross-cultural relationships. Dr. O'Sullivan had uncovered historical truths that had been buried for decades. But perhaps most significantly, hundreds of young people from both Africa and Ireland had formed friendships and partnerships that would influence their choices for the rest of their lives. They had learned to see each other not as representatives of different continents or cultures, but as individuals with shared hopes and complementary skills who could accomplish together what none of them could achieve alone. The Thomas Brennan Education Foundation had sponsored more than 200 scholarships in its first 5 years, enabling Congolese students to attend universities throughout Africa and Europe, while supporting Irish students who wanted to gain experience in international development work. Many of these students had returned to their home communities with new skills and broader perspectives, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate impact of their education. The foundation had also supported the establishment of sister relationships between churches in Ireland and Congo, enabling ongoing exchanges of ideas, resources, and personnel that enriched religious life in both places. These relationships had evolved beyond the traditional missionary model to become genuine partnerships, where both communities contributed to each other's spiritual and material well-being. The memorial site itself had become a model for sustainable tourism that benefited local communities while preserving cultural and environmental resources. The revenue generated by visitors had supported the improvement of schools and health clinics throughout the region, while the site's management structure ensured that local people maintained control over how their stories were told and their traditions were shared. As Samuel prepared to return to the village where he would spend the night before tomorrow's anniversary celebration, he reflected on how Thomas's story had become a catalyst for examining broader questions about the legacy of missionary work in Africa. The discovery of his remains had prompted honest conversations about the complexity of religious and cultural exchange during the colonial and post-colonial periods, leading to new models of international cooperation that emphasized mutuality rather than charity. Universities in both Ireland and Congo had established joint research programs that examined the historical impact of missionary work while developing new approaches to cross-cultural education and cooperation. These programs had produced scholarship that challenged both overly romantic and overly critical views of missionary history, revealing the complexity of relationships that could simultaneously involve exploitation and genuine care, cultural imperialism and authentic exchange. The anniversary celebration that began the following morning brought together the largest gathering ever assembled at Thomas's grave. More than 500 people participated in the three-day event, including government officials from both Ireland and Congo, church leaders from multiple denominations, academics from various universities, and hundreds of community members from throughout the region. The celebration began with a sunrise service at Thomas's grave, conducted jointly by religious leaders representing the various traditions that had been touched by his story. The service included readings from Thomas's journal, prayers in multiple languages, and music that blended Irish traditional songs with Congolese hymns and contemporary compositions created specifically for the occasion. Father Kalenga, now elevated to bishop and serving as a regional leader in the Catholic Church, delivered the main address at the anniversary service. Speaking in French with translation into English and Lingala, he reflected on how Thomas's story had challenged conventional assumptions about missionary work and cross-cultural relationships. Thomas Brennan came to Congo as a missionary, but he became something more. He became a bridge between worlds, a translator not just of languages but of hopes and dreams, Bishop Kalanga said. His decision to die here was not a rejection of his Irish heritage, but a declaration that love recognizes no boundaries, that service knows no limits, and that true faith requires us to become fully present wherever God calls us to serve. The bishop's address was followed by testimonies from scholarship recipients, community leaders, and visitors who had been influenced by their experience at the memorial site. These testimonies painted a picture of ongoing transformation that extended far beyond the original discovery of Thomas's remains. Maria O'Brien, a young Irish woman who had spent 2 years teaching at schools supported by the foundation, spoke about how her experience in Congo had changed her understanding of education and community development. She had returned to Ireland to pursue advanced degrees in international education and was planning to establish programs that would bring Congolese educational innovations to Irish schools. Patrice Mukendi, Samuel's younger brother who had received a foundation scholarship to study medicine in Belgium, described how his education had enabled him to return to Congo with skills that were desperately needed in rural communities. But more importantly, he said, his time in Europe had taught him to see his own culture with new appreciation and to find ways of combining traditional healing practices with modern medical techniques. The testimonies continued throughout the day, creating a tapestry of interconnected stories that demonstrated how one person's sacrifice had multiplied into countless opportunities for others. Children who had been born after Thomas's remains were discovered spoke about how his story had inspired them to dream beyond the boundaries of their immediate circumstances while remaining connected to their cultural roots. As the anniversary celebration concluded with an evening vigil at Thomas's grave, Samuel found himself thinking about the future of the memorial site and the ongoing legacy of Thomas's story. The wooden cross that marked the grave would eventually weather away, despite careful maintenance. But the relationships and institutions that had grown from Thomas's sacrifice would continue to evolve and multiply. Plans were already underway to establish additional memorial sites at other locations connected to Thomas's story, at the original mission station in Kisangani, at the church in County Cork where he had been ordained, and at Trinity College Dublin where Dr. O'Sullivan's research center had become a hub for studying Irish-African relationships. These sites would be connected not just symbolically but through ongoing programs that enabled people to trace the full arc of Thomas's journey from Ireland to Congo and to understand its continuing impact. The Thomas Brennan Education Foundation was developing partnerships with universities in other African countries, expanding the scope of educational exchange while maintaining the focus on relationships that honored both local knowledge and international perspectives. The Foundation's work was becoming a model for educational cooperation that could be adapted to other contexts and other relationships between developed and developing regions. Most significantly, the generation of young people who had been shaped by Thomas's story was beginning to assume leadership roles in their communities, bringing with them a vision of international cooperation that transcended traditional boundaries of nationality, race, and religion. These young leaders were creating new forms of partnership that built on the foundation Thomas had laid, while adapting to contemporary challenges and opportunities. As the final candles were lit beside Thomas's cross on the anniversary evening, Samuel offered a prayer that combined elements from Irish, Congolese, and universal traditions. May the seeds that were planted in love continue to grow in wisdom. May the bridges that were built in sacrifice continue to bear the weight of hope. May the silence that was broken in truth continue to speak in every language of the heart. The prayer was taken up by the gathered crowd, repeated in multiple languages, and carried by the evening breeze through the forest canopy toward the river where Thomas had first arrived in Congo more than 50 years earlier. It was a prayer that connected past and future, individual and community, local and global. A prayer that captured the essence of what Thomas Brennan had lived and died for, and what his story continued to inspire in all who encountered it. If stories like Thomas's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.